Well, today is September 8th, 2014, and it is about 10 o'clock at night, and I'll be going home soon. Just doing a little bit of work right now, and something for the past 2 weeks has been telling me I need to do a video. I need to post a video. There need to be record of what is happening because it's it's an emergency, and I don't know what's the best tool to use. I don't know what's the best language to use. I could do it in French. I could do it in my native tongue, either in Swahili, in Lingala. Um, I'm originally from the Congo, so that's why I'm using those languages as a reference point. But I think even living in English will be fine because as a young African, being born in a French-speaking country, I was still able to hear the words of Malcolm X and understand what he said back in the 60s. But to the matter at hand, I've been trying to figure out, do I need to write? How do I share this very serious issue that is going on? And this issue is really not necessarily about the war in the Congo, but it's around Ebola. The Ebola virus spread across the continent. I would say from Guinea all the way to Sierra Leone. For over 8 months, the African continent has been fighting to stop the spread of the Ebola virus. And I'm very concerned that a lot of young Africans are asleep. They are seriously asleep. And it's quite disheartening because I've engaged with a group of technologists and software developers in trying to help out in stopping the spread of the virus. But in their engagement, the more and more I learn about what is actually happening on the ground, not what's in the media, the more and more I start asking myself a question. Are Africans aware of what is happening on the African continent around Ebola? And are we speaking to people on the ground? So I just want to share what I've learned and why I think it's very important for Africans to be engaged. The first thing, before I go to those details, I will speak about something that's very critical. There is a serious push of militarization of the African continent. It's a term, even if I say it may not scare you at all, but I'm going to break it down for you. In 2003, the Heritage Foundation wrote a document around the creation of a U.S. military command for the African continent called AFRICOM. And in that so-called white paper, it gave scenarios of U.S. military engagement. That was 2003. And the U.S. military engagement that they proposed was around different situations on the continent that will require a greater military response from the United States. And why am I prefacing what I want to share with the U.S. and the U.S. military? Because it's very serious. The U.S. is operating on the African continent on over 40 countries on the African continent. I have yet seen one military base from an African country in the United States. There is not one African country that has a military base here in the United States. Yet, African leaders are allowing U.S. military bases on the continent. And yesterday, President Barack Obama, the United States President, responded to the Ebola crisis in saying that the United States will provide military support and logistics to the crisis. The reason even why I'm doing this video, because this was predictable, and I've shared it with a few colleagues, few friends, that this Ebola crisis is going to have U.S. military engagement in it. For many reasons. One, the inadequacy of some of the African leaders, in West Africa specifically, but in Africa as a whole, with these 54 nations, to addressing this issue. And we've seen how now we have over 2,000 Africans dead, and people are still not taking it to the serious level. But now, instead of having an African solution to the problem, we are calling out the West to come again with its solutions. And how did this come about? Why is President Barack Obama speaking about U.S. military intervention? I should say U.S. military support, providing quote-unquote logistical support to Africans around Ebola. And I guess that's the same type of logistical support that's being given to our people in Ferguson, Missouri, here in the United States. But no, that's another discussion for another day. But I need to speak on this Ebola thing because it's important for young Africans to wake up. Last week at the United Nations, to everyone's surprise, the director for Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, had a speech at the United Nations to call on world leaders to take the issue of Ebola seriously. I'm in agreement with her. But what made me raise my eyebrows, was that she called for military assets to be deployed in the region in support of humanitarian of the humanitarian crisis in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, Senegal now, right? And the first thing I ask myself is, why are we asking for military support? And she has been interviewed around, and she's shared the concerns that currently the institutions that have the power or the logistical capacity to support Médecins Sans Frontières, to support the World Health Organization in this crisis is the military, because they can bring in logistics with the airplanes and so on. And to me, that's very disconcerting. That the only organization in the world that can provide support to a humanitarian crisis is the military. That's the failure of the international community. That how come this is the case? And I understand the context. You know, she shared things such as that they're not able to get, whenever they got bed for patients, and they brought 800 beds within a day, all those beds were taken. And they needed to get support to be able to get more beds. African governments in the countries where they are do not have the capacity and so on. And I'm going to share now why also I'm very upset. Not just upset with U.S. military support coming up now, which is very problematic. Africa does not need U.S. military support. Africa needs world support with fair partners. You don't need to bring the U.S. military. We already see the impact of U.S. militarization, even here in the United States. Just look at what I just mentioned a moment ago, Ferguson, what is happening with increased militarization in the context of Africa, specifically with the Ebola, right in Liberia, the militarization of West Point, the quarantine of the area. We saw also the negative impact that he had in those communities, where we had a teenager killed by security forces in Liberia because there were riots and people were protesting that they were quarantined. Almost, it seemed to me that was pretty much a predictable genocide pushed by the government. You know, someone has Ebola in the area of thousands of people and you quarantine everyone else. That's the most ridiculous thing. That's another point. I'm going to share a lot of things. It may not make sense because my brain is turning to share with you what is really happening right now. That Africans are seriously asleep. They're not understanding what is actually happening on the continent, and they're not taking actions to determine their own affairs. Now, Congo, where I'm from, Congo has had over 6 outbreaks. And people in the Congo, the doctors and nurses who have worked on the issue many times, have best practices on how to treat it, how to contain the Ebola crisis. I was fortunate enough to get information about some of the survivors of Ebola in Congo. 14 of them are in Kinshasa right now. Many of them have said they're still shocked that before getting Western support, they're not reaching out to them to teach them best practices of that. I know now, since last month, there are Congolese doctors and Uganda doctors in Liberia supporting the Liberian government. But over 8 months, why now? Is it because now the Canadians and others are not packing shop and leaving that we have to look to the West for the answer to our problems? That shows also the issue we have with our leaders. They're really, my God. Our leaders are looking to Washington. They're asking the international community for money to support the Ebola crisis. They have no health policies in place or reform that they want to put in place to change the situation. Yet, the people on the ground are still suffering because of the bad governments they have. The Ebola crisis exposed the reality of the Africa that sometimes we don't want to talk about. How is it that the World Health Organization created a fund asking African countries to provide money to that fund, which will be equal to about $50 million every year, and that money will support crises such as the Ebola crisis right now? Yet, the countries affected, Liberia was supposed to pay $5,000 a year ago, and this year, they did not pay their $5,000 a year. Now, I don't know if you understand. There is a fund for crisis, right? Emergency crisis such as Ebola, that the World Health Organization established. The dues for Liberia, for Sierra Leone, and is $5,000. They didn't pay that. How come? And now that the crisis is around, the first thing is to ask the World Bank, the international community, to raise money. We have 54 African nations, and some of these nations have dealt with Ebola. Why can't we work with the other Africans to stop it? The second issue, why are you bringing European, American, international doctors who have never been exposed to Ebola? The closest they got to Ebola is reading it out of the book and putting them in the field before bringing African doctors who have dealt with the issue before. So those are the questions I keep asking myself, like, what is happening to these leaders? You know, sometimes you can get so frustrated with these leaders, and now I'm even beyond the point of saying I'm frustrated with the leaders. I'm frustrated with the African youth that's watching. And when I'm even speaking about the African youth, I'm speaking mainly from the African youth in the diaspora. What is it that you are doing around Ebola? So you're not worrying about Ebola because it's not in your country? Is that the reason why? Because that can spread across the continent very fast. And what's the best scenario? To have the United States colonize the African continent with its military, using a global disease crisis such as Ebola as a pretext for U.S. military intervention in Africa. And this has been ongoing. I mean, think about the CONI 2012, which many Africans thought that there is no reason why the U.S. should intervene with its military in Africa to catch a so-called warlord in Central African Republic. A good way to even look at it is, even though we have the U.S. military right in Central African Republic going after the so-called Joseph Kony, when there was a coup d'etat, right? There was a coup in Central African Republic. What did the U.S. military do? Nothing. They all watched what was going on. Then we saw the same push around Boko Haram, the call for U.S. military. Why do we have to continue to call for U.S. military intervention on the African continent? We have 54 African countries. So you are trying to tell me with 54 African countries, no other African nation can come to support an African country that has a crisis? That's what we have to discuss as young Africans. What is it that we are doing right now today to make sure that the issue of Sierra Leone, the issue of Liberia, the issue of Ghana without the cholera outbreak, the issue of Guinea is our issue. Because if we can see the Ebola crisis as our issue, you could care about other issues that's going on. Currently in Somalia, we have a report that just came out by Human Rights Watch showing how the Ugandan military has been raping the Somali women there while they are deployed as African forces in Somalia. So we know militarism is not the way to solve issues, because also those militaries that's coming, they are causing chaos in other countries. In the case of Congo, if you can care about Ebola, why would you even care about the 6 million people dead in Congo? You say that's another war in Central Africa that you have no idea what's actually happening there. That's why me as a Congolese, though I'm fighting for peace and stability in my country, in the Congo, I'm watching what's happening in West Africa. I'm seeing that as a big Pandora box that when open is going to completely transform the African continent. Because the solution being proposed right now, we're bringing the U.S. military. I'm trying to figure out what will an American soldier do to stop Ebola when they don't even know what Ebola is. We have to think more critically. What other information I want to pass out? I met a very interesting doctor, Dr. Tomislav Prolovich. He's a medical doctor who was in Congo in 1976 during the first Ebola outbreak. And he made a speech at the UN. I was lucky enough to be in the room when he spoke. And he presciently noted that one, Ebola is a bioweapon, just like smallpox, like plague. And that Ebola is not a death sentence. That if you get Ebola, you don't have to die from Ebola. There are certain things that one has to do to be able to be treated. And there are many survivors. He also said something very important, that the American doctor who was treated at Emory received blood transfusion before being flown back to the U.S. And the blood transfusion was from a young Liberian, a 14-year-old Liberian, who survived Ebola. And with that transfusion, he was able to transfer the antibodies from that young man to his body, and that helped him get much better. So as he was arriving in the U.S., while he was still in a tough condition, but not necessarily critical condition, he was getting better due to that. But what's very interesting to me is the media portrayal of what is going on. That most media, Western media, has been speaking about a medication called ZMapp, developed by some American laboratories here, tested on this American doctor. And I'm very concerned with that. I'm very concerned with that because I wish that the world knew, that they had the information, that there is a way to treat Ebola, and this information is not getting out there. Ebola outbreak happened in Congo over 6 times. There are people who died from Ebola. There are people who survived. And there is the best way to even treat it is known by these doctors. Why can we know the name of the doctors who worked on Ebola? Why do we have to have American doctors who never seen Ebola before discuss how you treat it? They never experienced it. Let's get the African doctors who have worked on this issue, share the best way, work on making sure that we treat it, instead of using now Africans as guinea pigs with this medication that's coming up. And lastly, and I think it's really a call to the African youth. It's why are we so asleep? The only reason the United States can have the audacity to say we are going to send military assets is because we are allowing that the affairs of the continent is not being controlled and determined by the sons and daughters of Africa. We should be holding our leaders accountable. The spread of Ebola is emblematic of the situation in many countries, lack of health infrastructure, lack of education. How do you, some prevention measure, for example, right? Let's say that to prevent the spread of Ebola, you have to make sure you wash your hands with clean water. And then you must have hand sanitizer. If in some countries, people will live with less than $1 a day, and then they don't have access to clean water, how do you think they're going to wash their hands with clean water? Where will they get money to get hand sanitizer? Then you have those who continue to speak about the so-called Africa Rising. They could care less what is happening to the average African who on the day and night is fighting to survive on this planet. Ebola is a weapon for the poor that would destroy the poor. And if you really care about people, if you really care about humanity, if you care about African people, you should pay very close attention to what's happening with Ebola. There should not be U.S. military intervention on the continent for a humanitarian crisis. If the United States need to support, bring doctors, right? Bring medical equipment, but you do not need to engage the U.S. military. And if the U.S. military is the solution or the so-called hope for Africa to stop Ebola, I'm telling you, this is really doomsday. And I hope for those Africans who are listening to this video, pick up your phone, call people back home, find out what is happening. Why we don't hear what's happening in Guinea. Over 400 people have died there. We don't know what is actually happening on the ground. How come people are being quarantined in areas that's rich of resources? And no one is holding anyone accountable for this. Why are African leaders asking, begging, continuing to beg for Western support before contacting countries that are closer to them? Have you spoken to Gambia? Have you spoken to Cote d'Ivoire? What are young Africans in the ECOWAS region doing to address the issues before having, like the director of the Médecins Sans Frontières saying nonsense such as we need to have military assets to support with stopping the Ebola crisis? That's a fallacy. What we need is humanity to care about other human beings. If we can do that, we can stop Ebola. I know I said a lot. It may not make sense, but I need to get it on record. I'm going to post it on the web. I just let it go. And hopefully someone will listen to this, will start watching what's happening in Sierra Leone, watching what's happening in Liberia, watching what's happening in Guinea, in Senegal. Even now in Congo, there is an outbreak of Ebola as well. And then start empowering the local communities with information and tools to control Ebola. If you get Ebola, you're not going to die. And don't allow the world to stigmatize Africa with Ebola. If you get it, you can be treated. You need to learn what are the best practices to treat it. African doctors know how to. And be careful before you take this medication, such as Zimap and other medication that's still on trial, to see if there are some healthier ways, natural ways of you treating the disease. Those doctors are still alive. So that's all I have to share now. I don't know if I'll ever do another video such as this because I was about to go home, but I'm worrying about the continent. I'm worrying not just about the Congo, I'm worrying about the African continent. If as Africans we can care, we cannot care about our brothers and sisters in West Africa who are being contaminated with Ebola, how will we even care about the 6 million dead in Congo? So that's my message for tonight, and feel free to share it with whoever would find this information helpful.